The rain didn't just fall in Manhattan that November. It sought you out. Elias Thorne stood in the dim, drafty corridor of the Riverside Memorial Chapel, his cheap suit clinging to his shoulders like a cold, wet second skin. Through the frosted glass of the reception hall doors, he could see the blurred, golden glow of chandeliers and the sharp, black silhouettes of the Sterling family. He heard a burst of laughter, bright, brittle, and expensive. It was his mother-in-law, Beatrice. He actually cried, she was telling a guest, her voice carrying easily through the door. As if a janitor's passing is a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. It's almost adorable how much the boy struggles to understand his own insignificance. Elias looked down at his father's old, silver wristwatch, the only thing he had left. His father, Arthur, had spent 40 years being insignificant to people like the Sterlings. But Elias remembered the weight of the leather-bound ledger Arthur had handed him in the hospital, and the way the old man's eyes had suddenly turned sharp and predatory. "Let them laugh, Elias," Arthur had whispered. "By dinner time, they'll be begging for the crumbs from your table." Elias took a breath, adjusted his damp tie, and turned away from the door. He wasn't going to fight them for a seat. He was going to wait for the lawyers. Because in exactly 3 hours, the Sterling's world was going to stop spinning. Elias Thorne was about to learn that his father's poverty was the greatest lie ever told, and the Sterling family was about to pay for every insult they ever hurled at him. If you love stories where the underdog finally gets his justice and the arrogant elite lose it all, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We bring you daily stories of shocking betrayals and life-changing secrets that you won't want to miss. Now, let's see what happens when the janitor's son becomes the most powerful man in the room. The November rain hammered against the arched windows of the Riverside Memorial Chapel, a cold, rhythmic drumming that felt like the only honest sound in the room. Elias Thorne stood at the periphery of the sanctuary, his fingers tracing the frayed hem of his $89 suit jacket. 50 feet away, in a casket that cost more than Elias earned in a semester of teaching history, lay Arthur Thorne, the man the world knew as a school janitor, and the only person who had ever truly seen Elias. The silence of the chapel was suddenly violated by a sharp, melodic peal of laughter. Elias turned to see his mother-in-law, Beatrice Sterling, leaning toward her husband Harrison. She wasn't whispering, she didn't feel the need to. To the Sterlings, the world was their private lounge, and everyone else was merely background noise. "Did you see the flowers on the casket, Harrison?" Beatrice smirked, her voice carrying over the soft organ music. "Carnations. It's so charmingly industrial. I suppose it's fitting for a man who spent 40 years pushing a broom." "At least he's consistent," Preston Sterling chimed in, adjusted his $3,000 silk tie with a look of bored disdain. "The son's suit looks like it was stitched together from recycled curtains. Honestly, Vivienne, how do you stand the smell of polyester at dinner?" Elias looked at his wife. Vivienne Sterling Thorne stood among them, a vision of polished grief in a bespoke black veil. She didn't defend him. She didn't even look at him. She simply stared at her diamond-encrusted watch, her silence a heavy, complicit weight in the air. When Elias took a step toward the front pew to sit beside his wife, Beatrice stepped into his path, her eyes cold as glacial runoff. "Not today, Elias," she said, her voice dropping to a jagged edge. "This is a moment for the family and our associates. People who matter. The help doesn't belong in the front row, even if they've married into a name they can't afford. Why don't you wait in the hallway? I'm sure there's a spill somewhere that needs your hereditary expertise." Preston let out a soft, mocking clap. Elias felt the heat rise in his neck, the familiar sting of 1,000 small cuts. He looked at the casket one last time, remembering Arthur's final, raspy whisper, "Let them think they've won, son. Just wait for the lawyers." He turned on his heel and walked into the shadows of the vestibule, the laughter of the Sterlings echoing behind him like the tolling of a bell. The heavy oak doors of the chapel swung open with a resonant thud that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards, cutting through the Sterlings' laughter like a blade. A man stepped into the foyer, silhouetted against the grey Manhattan rain. He was draped in a charcoal grey wool overcoat that screamed Savile Row, a garment that likely cost more than the Sterlings' combined liquid assets for the month. He moved with the quiet, predatory grace of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be the most powerful person in the room. In his right hand, He gripped a weathered but impeccably crafted tan leather briefcase. He didn't look at the grieving widow or the floral arrangements. His eyes, sharp and cold as flint, locked onto Elias. "Mr. Elias Thorne?" the stranger asked. His voice was a rich baritone that commanded an immediate, instinctive silence. "I am," Elias replied, stepping out of the shadows of the hallway. Before Elias could say more, Harrison Sterling marched forward, his face flushed with the indignity of the interruption. "Look here, whatever you're selling, we're in the middle of a private family engagement. This is a funeral, not a boardroom. Security is right outside." The stranger didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Harrison. He simply reached into his coat and produced a heavy, cream-colored business card. "Marcus Thornton, of Thornton, Cross, and Associates. I am the executor of the estate of Arthur Thorne." Preston Sterling let out a sharp, mocking snort. "The executor of a janitor's estate? What's in that briefcase, Thornton?" "A collection of vintage mops. A final bill for the funeral car." Beatrice joined in, her voice dripping with condescension. "Really, Elias, even in death your father manages to be an embarrassment. Send this man to the service entrance. We have a dinner reservation at Le Coucou that we've already delayed for this affair." Marcus Thornton turned his head slowly, his gaze pinning Beatrice to her spot. The air in the room suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. "I wouldn't worry about your dinner reservations, Mrs. Sterling. You're going to find your appetite quite diminished once we begin the formal reading of the will." "The will?" Vivienne finally spoke, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "My father-in-law lived in a rent-controlled apartment in Queens. There is no estate to read." Thornton set his briefcase down on a velvet-topped podium and snapped the brass latches. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the silent chapel. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, bound by a blue ribbon. "On the contrary, Mrs. Thorne," Thornton said, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I am here to oversee the distribution of the Thorne holdings. As of the closing of the New York Stock Exchange yesterday, the total valuation of Arthur Thorne's liquid assets, real estate portfolio, and private equity interest stands at $74,312,000. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. Harrison's glass of wine tilted precariously in his hand. Beatrice's mouth hung open, her carefully curated mask of elegance shattering into 1,000 pieces. 74 million. Harrison whispered, his voice cracking. Thornton looked at the Sterlings with a faint, chilling smile. "And $400. Now, if the family would care to take their seats, I believe the deceased has a few final words for you all." The heavy silence in the chapel was thick enough to choke on. Marcus Thornton cleared his throat, the sound sharp and clinical as he adjusted his glasses and looked down at the ledger bound in weathered black leather. Elias stood motionless, his heart hammering against his ribs, while the Sterlings sat frozen in the front pew like statues of salt. "To understand the estate of Arthur Thorne," Thornton began, his voice echoing with a newfound gravity, "one must understand the man's patience. Arthur didn't believe in the flash of the market, he believed in the foundation of the future." He flipped a page, and the crisp rustle of paper felt like a gavel striking. "We begin with the primary equity holdings. In the spring of 1997, while the rest of the world was skeptical of a niche computer company in California, Arthur Thorne began a monthly purchase plan. He bought shares of Apple Incorporated religiously for 25 years. He never sold a single unit. As of today, that position alone, split-adjusted and dividend reinvested, accounts for $32 million. Harrison Sterling let out a strangled sound, somewhere between a cough and a sob. He had spent the last decade bragging about his aggressive hedge fund maneuvers that barely beat the S&P 500, yet here was a man who pushed a broom, sitting on a tech goldmine. "Furthermore," Thornton continued, his eyes flicking toward Preston, who had gone remarkably pale, "your father was an early participant in the decentralized finance movement. In 2011, Arthur acquired 4,000 units of Bitcoin when they were valued at less than $15 each. He moved them to a cold storage vault and left them untouched." Thornton paused for effect. "At current market rates, that digital ledger represents over $28 million in liquid capital." Preston's hand moved instinctively to his silk tie, loosening it as if the air in the chapel had suddenly vanished. He had spent the last 3 years calling Elias a legacy of poverty, yet Elias was now looking at a fortune that dwarfed the Sterling's family trust. There are also holdings in Amazon, early-stage index funds, and a collection of multifamily real estate deeds in Queens and Brooklyn that were purchased during the 1980s market dip, Thornton added, closing the ledger with a soft thud. Arthur Thorne didn't live like a millionaire because he didn't care for the theatre of wealth. He lived as he did because he wanted to ensure that when he spoke for the final time, the world would have no choice but to listen. Beatrice Sterling leaned back, her face a mask of horrified realization. The man she had treated like a piece of furniture, the man she had mocked for his industrial smell and his simple clothes, had been a silent titan. Elias looked at the ledger, then at the casket. He realized then that his father's simple life was the greatest performance of all, a long-term investment in a revenge that was only just beginning to pay out. Marcus Thornton's hands were steady as he drew 2 crisp, single-dollar bills from his briefcase and laid them side by side on the mahogany podium. The green ink looked garish against the somber wood, a deliberate insult that made Harrison Sterling's eye twitch with suppressed rage. "We move now to the specific personal bequests," Thornton said, his voice dropping into a register that was chillingly formal. "To Harrison and Beatrice Sterling, my father has left a shared gift. $1 each, and a final assessment of their worth." Beatrice let out a sharp, jagged gasp, her hand flying to the pearls at her throat. "This is an outrage. Arthur was a senile janitor. We are the Sterlings. You cannot possibly expect us to sit here and—" "Sit down, Beatrice," Thornton interrupted, his gaze like iron. "The law requires the reading of the memorandum attached to the bequest. If you leave, you forfeit any right to contest the subsequent legal actions mentioned herein." Reluctantly, they sank back into the pew, looking like trapped animals. Thornton began to read Arthur's words. "To Harrison," the lawyer read, "my father writes, I spent 40 years cleaning up the messes of men like you. You walk through life believing that because you have inherited a name and a firm, you have also inherited a soul. You haven't. I watched you for 8 years. I watched you belittle my son for his choice to teach, a profession that requires a depth of character you could never fathom. You are a man built of glass and borrowed interest. You have spent your life looking down on those who keep the world running, never realizing that the dirt you think you see on them is actually the rot inside yourself. I leave you this $1 so that, for the first time in your life, you are forced to hold exactly what you have earned through your own merit." Harrison's face turned a deep, bruised purple. His fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. "And to Beatrice," Thornton continued, his voice unwavering, "you once told my son that the help doesn't belong in the room. You were right. Excellence doesn't belong in the company of the superficial. You value people based on the labels in their clothes, yet you are the most transparent woman I have ever met. You are not a matriarch, you are a curator of shadows. I leave you this $1 to remind you that while beauty can be bought, class is an inheritance of the spirit, one you have squandered entirely." The chapel was so silent that the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a sledgehammer. Beatrice looked as though she had been struck. The social armor she had worn for decades, the Chanel, the diamonds, the calculated smiles, seemed to dissolve, leaving her exposed and small. Elias watched them, feeling a strange, cold peace wash over him. For years, he had swallowed their venom to keep the peace for Vivienne's sake. Now, his father was speaking the truths Elias had been too kind to utter. It wasn't just a will, it was a mirror, and for the first time, the Sterlings were forced to look at their own reflection. Marcus Thornton didn't let the silence linger. He reached back into the tan leather briefcase and pulled out a separate, heavy manila folder marked with a crimson confidential stamp. The sight of it seemed to drain the remaining color from Harrison Sterling's face. If the $1 bequest was a slap in the face, this folder was a firing squad. "We now address the secondary provision of the estate," Thornton said, his voice dropping into a tone of clinical execution. Arthur Thorne was a man of quiet observation. For 12 years, while he maintained the offices at Sterling Capital as part of the custodial staff, he didn't just empty waste bins. He witnessed the mechanics of your greed. Thornton opened the folder, revealing a series of high-resolution photographs of ledgers, wire transfer receipts, and encrypted account numbers. My father was aware that Harrison Sterling utilized a network of shell companies, primarily Blue Water Holdings and Stuyvesant Global, to divert approximately $18.7 million into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. He meticulously documented every transaction that bypassed federal oversight. Harrison surged to his feet, his voice a panicked screech. That's theft. Those are private corporate records. He was a janitor, not a forensic auditor. This evidence is inadmissible. On the contrary, Mr. Sterling, Thornton replied, looking over the rim of his glasses with predatory calm. As a member of the night staff with authorized keycard access to every office in the building, your father was simply tidying up documents left in plain sight on desks and in unsecured recycling bins. More importantly, he didn't give this evidence to me. He gave it to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service 3 months before he passed away. Beatrice let out a sound like a punctured tire. Vivienne looked at her father, then at Elias, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The mediocre family they had mocked hadn't just been hiding money, they had been building a cage. The IRS has been sitting on this data, waiting for the trigger event of Arthur's death to freeze the associated domestic accounts, Thornton continued, oblivious to Harrison's trembling hands. At this very moment, federal agents are likely entering the Sterling Capital headquarters on Park Avenue. Your personal assets, your properties in the Hamptons, and the family trust have been flagged for immediate seizure pending a full audit. Elias watched the man who had called him the help collapse back into his seat, his expensive suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big. The Sterlings had spent 20 years building a fortress of vanity, never realizing that the man emptying their trash was the one who held the blueprints to their destruction. Arthur Thorne hadn't just left his son a fortune, he had cleared the path by removing the monsters who stood in his way. Thornton turned a page, his expression unchanged. Now, let us discuss the conditions Elias must meet to finalize the transfer of the $74 million. It involves a set of recordings. Marcus Thornton waited for the sound of Harrison Sterling's heavy breathing to subside before he reached into his briefcase one final time. He didn't pull out a check or a deed. Instead, he withdrew a small, sleek external hard drive and a set of professional-grade studio headphones. He placed them on the mahogany podium with a reverence that suggested they were more valuable than all the gold in the Sterling vaults. The wealth of Arthur Thorne is not a gift of convenience, Thornton stated, his eyes locking onto Elias. Your father was acutely aware that money, in the wrong hands or under the delusions of a false reality, is merely a gilded cage. He wanted you to be free, Elias. Truly free. To ensure that, he has placed a singular, non-negotiable condition on the release of the $74 million. Vivienne leaned forward, her voice trembling with a mixture of greed and fear. What condition? His the son. The money is his. Surely we can just sign the paperwork and move past this unpleasantness. Thornton ignored her, focusing entirely on Elias. Contained on this drive are 127 hours of audio recordings. They span the last 8 years, from the day you proposed to Vivienne to the night before your father entered the hospital. They are recordings of the Westbrook offices, the Sterling estate during holidays, and private conversations held within your own home. A visible shiver ran through the Sterling family. Preston looked as though he might be physically ill. The condition is this, Thornton continued. Elias must listen to every single second of these recordings. He must do so alone, in the quiet of his own time. The principal inheritance will remain in a restricted escrow account until I receive a signed affidavit from Elias confirming he has heard the truth in its entirety. Only then will the funds be released. If he refuses, or if he attempts to bypass the recordings, the entire $74 million will be donated to the New York public school system to fund history departments in his honor. That's insane. Harrison barked, slamming his hand against the pew. You're asking him to listen to 5 days of, what? Footsteps? Office gossip? It's a stalling tactic. It is a diagnostic tool, Thornton countered sharply. Arthur wanted Elias to hear the things said when he wasn't in the room. He wanted his son to see the world not as he wished it to be, but as it actually is. He knew that the Sterlings wore masks, Elias. He spent a decade recording the moments those masks slipped. Elias looked at the small black drive. It felt heavy with the weight of 1,000 secrets. He looked at Vivienne, who was now looking at the drive with the expression of a woman watching a ticking bomb. Her face was a mask of pale terror. She knew exactly what was on those tapes. She knew about the whispered jokes in the kitchen, the mocking laughter shared with her brother over Thanksgiving dinner, and the cold calculations made about Elias's mediocre future. 127 hours, Elias whispered, his voice steady for the first time that day. 127 hours of the truth, Elias, Thornton confirmed. Your father told me that the truth is the only thing expensive enough to buy a man his soul back. The choice is yours. You can walk away now and remain the man they think you are, or you can listen and become the man your father knew you could be. Elias reached out and took the drive. The plastic was cool against his palm. He felt the eyes of the Sterlings, predatory, desperate, and pleading, all at once. He didn't look back at them. He tucked the drive into his pocket, the condition of truth now a physical weight against his hip. The funeral was over, but the reckoning had just begun. The silence of Elias's small, darkened apartment felt absolute, broken only by the low hum of the laptop and the rhythmic rain against the glass. He had been sitting in the same chair for 4 days, a marathon of auditory trauma. He had heard Harrison's schemes to dismantle public education and Beatrice's cruel mockery of Elias's peasant wardrobe. But as the clock struck midnight, he reached the final file. File number 127. The date on the metadata was from 6 months ago, Arthur's retirement party. The background noise was a chaotic symphony of crystal clinking and expensive laughter. Then, the audio sharpened. A door had closed, muffling the party. It was the library of the Sterling estate. He's actually wearing that brown corduroy jacket again, Viv, Preston's voice rang out, clear and sharp. I saw a waiter mistake him for the coat check guy. It's embarrassing. Why do you keep him around? You're a Sterling. You could have had anyone, a senator, a developer, a man with a pulse. Elias held his breath, his hands trembling against the edge of the desk. He waited for Vivienne's defense. He waited for the woman who kissed him every morning to tell her brother to shut his mouth. There was a long pause, the sound of a glass being set down on a marble surface. Then, Vivienne's voice drifted through the headphones, cool, detached, and weary. It isn't that simple, Preston. Do you know how exhausting it is to be a Sterling? To always be competing, always watching your back for the next scandal. So what? Preston countered. That justifies being married to a man who gets excited about a sale on history textbooks. You don't understand, Vivienne replied, and Elias could hear the thin, jagged smile in her voice. Elias is safe. He is perfectly, wonderfully predictable. He's boring. Preston. He's the human equivalent of a beige wall. I married him because I knew he would never challenge me. He'll never leave, he'll never cheat, and he'll never be smart enough to realize that I spend more on my weekend trips to Aspen than he makes in a year. He's my anchor. Every high flyer needs a place to land where they don't have to perform. He's my retirement from the real world. But don't you get bored? Preston asked, laughing. Of course I'm bored, Vivienne snapped, a sudden flash of venom in her tone. I'm bored out of my mind. Every time he starts talking about the Civil War or some fascinating local archive, I just tune him out and think about the next board meeting. But he's useful. He keeps the family image grounded, and is too grateful for my attention to ever grow a spine. He's a pet. Preston. A loyal, dull, harmless pet. The recording ended with the sound of the library door opening and the swell of the party music returning. Elias sat in the dark, the headphones still clamped over his ears, listening to the static of the empty file. The pain wasn't sharp, it was cold and heavy, like a stone settling in his gut. He didn't cry. The pet had just been given the keys to the kennel, and he realized that his father hadn't left him this file to hurt him, but to wake him up. He looked at the charcoal suit hanging on his closet door, the one Marcus Thornton had sent over. He wasn't a beige wall. He was the man who now held the deed to their lives. He reached for his phone and dialed Thornton's private line. I've finished the recordings, Elias said, his voice sounding like a stranger's, hard, certain, and dangerous. Launch the filing. I want the divorce papers served at the Sterling Capital press conference tomorrow morning. And Marcus, make sure the IRS knows about the blue water ledgers tonight. The morning air was crisp and biting as Elias stood on the sidewalk outside the Sterling Capital headquarters. In his hand was a manila envelope. In his pocket, the keys to a life he had never dared to imagine. As the sleek black town cars began to pull up for the emergency press conference the Sterlings had called to clarify their financial standing, Elias saw Vivienne step out of a vehicle, her expression a mix of frayed nerves and practiced elegance. She stopped dead when she saw him. Elias, what are you doing here? You should be at the apartment. We have lawyers coming over to discuss how to handle your father's estate. We need to consolidate those funds immediately to protect the family interest. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even feel the old urge to apologize for his presence. There is no we, Vivienne. And there is no consolidation. He handed her the envelope. Inside were the divorce papers, but more importantly, a copy of the irrevocable trust document Arthur had established 3 years prior. Arthur hadn't just saved money, he had built a legal fortress. The Thorne Marital Asset Protection Clause stipulated that in the event of a divorce where irreconcilable character defamation was proven, via the audio files Elias had just authenticated, the spouse would be entitled to exactly 0% of the Thorne estate. Furthermore, because Elias had used his teacher's salary to pay the rent on their shared apartment while Vivienne reinvested her earnings into the now-seized Sterling trusts, she had no claim to the roof over her head. "You're divorcing me," she whispered, her voice cracking as she scanned the brutal legal language. "Elias, you're being emotional. You're hurt because of the tapes, but that's just talk. We're a team. You can't survive without the Sterling name." "The Sterling name is currently being scrubbed off the lobby walls by federal agents, Vivienne," Elias said calmly. "And as for surviving, I've spent 8 years surviving you. Now, I'm going to start living." He turned away from her, ignoring her sudden, desperate pleas, and signaled for a car that Marcus Thornton had arranged. As the vehicle pulled away, he watched the reflection of the Sterling building fade in the window. An hour later, Elias stood in the center of a sprawling, light-filled brownstone apartment in Brooklyn Heights. The floors were reclaimed white oak, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline, the very skyline his father had helped build, one floor at a time, with a broom in his hand. The space was quiet, airy, and entirely his. There were no Sterling family portraits here. No heavy, oppressive antiques. Just a single box he had brought with him, his father's old ledger, his history books, and the hard drive that had set him free. He walked to the window and looked out at the Statue of Liberty in the distance. For the first time in his adult life, the weight in his chest was gone. He was 23 stories up, but for the first time, he felt like his feet were finally on solid ground. He picked up his phone and sent a final text to Marcus. "The pet has left the building. Begin the wire transfers for the foundation." The downfall of the Sterling Empire did not happen with a bang, but with the synchronized chime of a dozen federal agent cell phones. From his new balcony in Brooklyn Heights, Elias watched the news cycle ignite. The headline scrolling across the bottom of every financial network was a death knell: Sterling Capital assets frozen, patriarch charged with conspiracy and racketeering. At the Park Avenue headquarters, the scene was one of absolute chaos. Harrison Sterling was being led through the gold-leafed lobby he once walked like a king, his hands cinched behind his back in cold, steel zip ties. The cameras captured every second of his humiliation, the way his face turned a mottled, desperate gray, and the way he tried to hide his face behind a legal pad as he was shoved into the back of a black government SUV. The evidence Arthur Thorne had gathered was so airtight that the judge had denied bail within the hour, citing Harrison as a high-flight risk with significant offshore resources. The ripple effect was instantaneous. In the hyper-competitive circles of Manhattan's elite, the Sterlings became radioactive overnight. By noon, Beatrice Sterling found herself standing on the sidewalk outside the exclusive Bergdorf Goodman. Her credit cards declined and her personal driver nowhere to be found. His salary had gone unpaid for 3 weeks, and he had simply walked away with the keys to the Bentley. Her friends, women she had lunched with for decades, crossed the street to avoid her, their eyes fixed firmly on their phones. The invitations to the winter galas were rescinded via cold, automated emails. The Sterling name, once a passport to the city's most private rooms, was now a brand of shame. Preston fared no better. The hedge fund he managed, built almost entirely on capital borrowed from his father's illegal offshore accounts, was shuttered by the SEC. His colleagues, men who had laughed at his jokes about the janitor's son just days prior, were the first to give depositions against him to save their own careers. He was evicted from his penthouse by evening, his belongings piled into cardboard boxes that sat on the curb, soaked by the relentless New York drizzle. Vivienne was the last to fall. She stood in the empty foyer of their former apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of her own arrogance. She had tried to call Elias 42 times, but each call was diverted to a robotic recording. She had no access to the Thorn millions, and with the sterling accounts frozen, she was effectively penniless. She realized with a gut-wrenching finality that she had traded a man of genuine substance for a family of paper tigers. Elias watched the sun set over the city, the light catching the glass of the skyscrapers. He felt no surge of joy at their ruin, only a profound sense of equilibrium. The house of cards had fallen not because of his malice, but because of its own hollow foundation. His father had seen the rot decades ago. Elias had simply been the one to pull the final thread. As the city lights flickered on, he closed his laptop on the last of the Sterling news alerts. The era of the Sterlings was over. The era of the Thorn legacy was just beginning. 1 year after the collapse of Sterling Capital, the rain returned to New York, but Elias Thorn no longer felt its chill. He stood in the lobby of a meticulously restored brownstone in Queens, the very neighborhood where his father had spent 40 years quietly building a fortune while others looked down on his uniform. Above the entrance, etched in simple, dignified granite, were the words, "The Arthur Thorn Legacy Center." The $74 million had not been spent on yachts, offshore accounts, or the hollow trappings of prestige. Instead, Elias had funneled the wealth into a foundation designed to catch the very students the Sterlings of the world dismissed as mediocre. These were the C students with brilliant hearts, the children of immigrants who worked 2 jobs, and the quiet dreamers who simply needed a bridge to the future. Inside the center, the air was filled with the hum of productivity. In one room, a retired university professor was tutoring a group of local teens in constitutional law. In another, a high-tech lab provided resources that rivaled the private academies Preston Sterling had once attended. Elias walked through the halls, greeting students by name. He was still a teacher at heart, but now his classroom had no walls. "Mr. Thorn," a young woman named Maria called out, clutching a thick envelope. "I got the scholarship. The one for the pre-law program at NYU. They said the Thorn Foundation is covering everything. Books, tuition, even a stipend for my mom." Elias smiled, feeling a warmth that no amount of sterling money could ever buy. "You earned it, Maria. My father always said that the most important investment you can make isn't in a stock, but in a person who knows the value of a hard day's work." The day ended with a quiet ceremony in the center's garden. Marcus Thornton was there, looking less like a predatory litigator and more like a man satisfied with a job well done. He handed Elias a final report. The Sterling's remaining properties had been liquidated, and the proceeds, by court order, had been redirected into the foundation's endowment. The very bricks of the Sterling Empire were now paying for the education of the help. As the sun set, Elias took a seat on a bench dedicated to his father. He pulled a small, worn object from his pocket, Arthur's old janitor's key ring. It served as a constant reminder that power doesn't come from the size of your office, but from the depth of your silence and the strength of your strategy. Vivienne was a ghost now, a name mentioned only in legal archives and cautionary tales of social ruin. Elias, however, was finally a thorn in the way his father intended, rooted, resilient, and life-giving. He looked up at the evening sky, the city lights beginning to twinkle like the data points on Arthur's old ledger. "We did it, Dad," Elias whispered into the cool evening air. He wasn't the pet anymore. He wasn't a beige wall. He was the architect of a new history, proving that while wealth can be inherited, a legacy must be built, one student, one book, and one truth at a time. The janitor's son had cleaned up the world's mess, and in its place, he had planted a forest.